Simon and Mia, I'm so proud of you. Thank you for bringing us such good wisdom from our Parsha. Simon, you asked why Pharaoh would choose Joseph, a man with no leadership experience, to be such an important leader. Whether it was because it was Joseph's destiny or because of his relationship with God or because of his excellent intentions and strategy, you saw that Joseph had the qualities to be an excellent leader, which is something that you told us all of us should be learning from and that you yourself have tried to be. And Mia, you taught us that there are different views of dreams in Jewish tradition. Some say that there can be multiple true interpretations of a dream, and some say that there's really only one true interpretation. But they all say that dreams contain truth. And Joseph's role and talent was in discerning the truth within a dream. And you also said that the dreams we have when we're awake, what you call prophetic dreams, can come true. And that we ought to dream big in our lives for ourselves and for our world. I'm going to offer you this morning a teaching shared with me by my Chevruta, Rabbi Kaya Stern-Kaufman. She told me that Reb Nosson, a Hasidic rabbi who lived at the turn of the 19th century and was the chief scribe of Nachman of Breslov, writes about Joseph's dream interpretations. And he says that Joseph was called Hatzadik, the tzaddik, the righteous one, because he had the capacity to see truth and to save people from disastrous outcomes. Reb Nosson points out that dream interpretation is the ability to see truth in the dark. It's not an accident that last week we saw Joseph interpret dreams in the dungeon, in the deepest, darkest place, and in the deepest, darkest time. His gift is to bring the light of truth out of the darkness of confusion. Reb Nosson further says that there is a quality of truth is emet in Hebrew, that is also compassion. Compassion is rachamim in Hebrew. In other words, that there's a kind of truth that is the same thing as compassion. He says that there are different layers of truth, and deep truth is connected to rachamim, compassion, because deep truth creates connections between things that seem separate, bringing together disparate pieces into a wholeness that supports new life. In the Talmud, as you taught us, Mia, the rabbis teach that there is truth in dreams, but the truth is mixed together with falsehood. Joseph's gift was to be able to see truth even when it was mixed with falsehood. The stories that we tell in our lives, the things we say, almost always contain a mixture of falsehood and truth. It's almost always partial truth, because there are almost always parts missing to what we can see. This is easy to notice when someone else is telling a story about the world and it doesn't include our own truth. But it's harder to see when we're the ones telling the story and we're leaving out someone else's truth. This, Reb Nosson says, is called superficial truth. Stories and ideas that contain elements of truth, but not the whole truth. And he says that superficial truth tends to divide rather than connect. Whereas Joseph's gift was to see through superficial truth to deep truth, and to use deep truth to avert disaster and support life. My friend, Rabbi Stern-Kaufman, urges that we each consider when we speak whether what we're going to say will be a superficial truth that leads to more division, or will be a deep truth that brings disparate pieces together and creates more wholeness, more compassion, and more life. Since October 7th, I've been trying to tell deeper truths wherever possible, but I am no Joseph, and I know that like all ordinary human beings, I'm missing parts of the truth in what I can see. In this week, I need to talk about what's happening in American universities, and I'm aware that I don't quite see the deepest layers of truth, but I will try to bring some disparate pieces together in a way that leads to some greater wholeness, hopefully fostering compassion and supporting life. Last week's contentious congressional hearing on college anti-Semitism with 3 university presidents was full of superficial truths. Truths that divide and truths that add to the darkness of confusion. It's true, as the university president said, that First Amendment freedoms of speech judgments depend on context. It's true that under the First Amendment, only speech that is conveyed as a threat or part of a pattern of harassment is punishable. But that's also a superficial truth. It's not the whole truth, because private institutions are not fully subject to those First Amendment protections. It's a superficial truth because the colleges and universities the presidents represent do block and punish some hate speech that is not directly threatening or harassment. And the presidents did not explain or acknowledge that inconsistency. For their part, the members of Congress questioning the university presidents told even more superficial truths. It's true that there is a massive and unacceptable problem of anti-Semitism on college campuses. It's true that many universities have failed to properly address it. It's true that there is a double standard operating in some universities wherein anti-Semitic speech is more permitted than racist or anti-LGBT speech. It's true that the university presidents should have been able to provide not just legal answers, but moral leadership by clearly denouncing calls for the genocide of Jews. But in their questions, the Republican committee members made a leap between language like "from the river to the sea" and calls for genocide. When some people say "from the river to the sea," they do mean genocide. And by the way, some right-wing Israelis sometimes use that same language in the other direction, including in the original Likud platform. But we know that many people who are chanting "from the river to the sea" don't know what it means. A recent poll in the Wall Street Journal showed that less than half of the people chanting "from the river to the sea" can name what river or what sea they're talking about. Many are not intending to call for the genocide of Jews. We can see how superficial truths that appeared in this hearing did not bring light to a moment of true peril and true isolation for the Jewish people, but instead added to the darkness of confusion and division. It turns out that this hearing was part of a much larger agenda to discredit universities, an agenda that has nothing to do with protecting Jews. The Republican Party has a long-standing goal of dismantling the institutions of liberal democracy, and many are cynically using Jews and our pain to advance this agenda. Elise Stefanik, the member of Congress who was theoretically defending Jews from calls for genocide, is the same person who spread the anti-Semitic Great Replacement theory 2 days after the Buffalo mass shooting inspired by that theory. In case you don't know, the Great Replacement theory is a white nationalist conspiracy theory that says that Jews are working to replace white people in America with immigrants and black people, and that white people need to fight back. Remember when the Nazis in Charlottesville marched with torches chanting, "Jews will not replace us"? They were talking about the Great Replacement theory. 2 hours before he murdered 11 Jews at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, the white shooter wrote on social media about HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, quote, "HIAS likes to bring invaders in that kill our people. I can't sit by and watch my people get slaughtered. Screw your optics, I'm going in." And then he opened fire inside the synagogue. A couple of weeks earlier, the same shooter wrote, "Why, hello there, HIAS. You like to bring in hostile invaders to dwell among us." And he wrote, "Open your eyes. It's the filthy, evil Jews bringing filthy, evil Muslims into our country." Elise Stefanik, who was pretending to stand up for Jews this week at that hearing, spreads the Great Replacement theory and did so after a mass shooting inspired by it. And Elise Stefanik supports Donald Trump. A few days after the Tree of Life massacre, when 11 Jews were murdered by an anti-Semite, Donald Trump spread the Great Replacement theory on social media 2 days after. And remember that Donald Trump said of the Nazis in Charlottesville after they killed a woman that there were very fine people on both sides. And when he was questioned later about it, he said that he answered perfectly. That's a quote. And that's why 59% of American Jews blamed Donald Trump for contributing to attacks on Jews while he was president. And remember that Donald Trump had dinner with Kanye West after West posted a swastika and said Hitler was right. And with Nick Fuentes, a leading Nazi who marched in Charlottesville and said that immigration and efforts for civil rights are, quote, bastardized Jewish subversion of the American creed. Donald Trump, the leader of the Republican Party, also has attacked liberal Jews by name multiple times since being president. And since 50% of American Jews identify as liberal and 70% are Democrats, attacking liberal Jews is attacking Jews. It makes sense that only 26% of Jews in America say that they trust the Republican Party, which has now become so deeply infected with the Great Replacement theory and other anti-Semitic ideas, to fight anti-Semitism after October 7th. As Elad Nehorai, an activist against anti-Semitism, wrote this week, this is who is waging the war against the presidents of the universities, an anti-Semite who is part of an anti-Semitic party led by an anti-Semitic presidential candidate, which are both blamed by the majority of Jews for contributing to mass shootings of Jews in America. We've seen other leaders of the Republican Party stoke culture wars in education in order to gain political power and dismantle liberal democracy. Ron DeSantis used wokeness on college campuses as one of his main presidential campaign talking points until he realized it wasn't gaining traction with voters. But this focus now on college anti-Semitism is giving the culture wars a whole new life. But first, DeSantis's Don't Say Gay law banned classroom instruction on gender identity and sexual orientation in all grades in Florida, and his Stop Woke Act, signed into Florida law last year, targets schools, colleges, universities, and corporations who teach critical race theory, the New York Times' 1619 Project, or engage in DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion education. According to the Chronicle of Higher Education, legislators in more than 20 states have now introduced more than 30 bills targeting the teaching of race and LGBT subjects in schools and universities. According to PEN America, in the 2022-2023 school year, 3,362 books were banned nationwide. This is a record in American history. Overwhelmingly, these are books about people of color or race or about LGBT people. Elad Nehorai says, anti-Semitism accusations are just the latest cudgel in this war. Previous cudgels included critical race theory, gender-affirming care and trans rights, and COVID. In each one of these cases, the culture wars that surrounded colleges were a cover for the deeper attacks on academic freedom, education, and free speech in America. Attacks on academic freedom, education, and free speech are familiar early tactics of fascist and theocratic governments. Eden McLean, a historian of fascism and Italian fascist education, wrote in Scientific American earlier this year that one of Benito Mussolini's first moves as he was building power in the 1920s was to use the Italian Ministry of Education to control school curricula and textbooks, to ensure that they rejected contradictory viewpoints and supported ideas of Italian racial superiority. We know that Hitler and the Nazis did the same in March of 1933. And by the way, Iran and Afghanistan did the same when their theocratic regimes were gaining power. Democracy is in crisis all around the world. A 2022 report from the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance found that over the past 6 years, the number of countries moving toward authoritarianism is more than double the number moving toward democracy. And nearly half of the 173 countries assessed are experiencing declines in at least one metric of democracy. This week in the New York Times, Charles Blow wrote that according to a July Gallup report, quote, confidence in many of our major institutions in this country, including schools, big business, and the news media, is at or near its lowest point in the past half century. This is, he said, in part because of Donald Trump-led right-wing projects to depress that confidence. And as people lose faith in these institutions, he said, many being central to maintaining the social contract that democracies offer, they can lose faith in democracy itself. People then lose their fear of a candidate like Trump. This is so dangerous. It's dangerous for all of us. This Republican tactic of focusing on anti-Semitism in colleges and universities achieves 3 and possibly 4 Trump goals all at once. First, it diverts attention away from the rampant and often genocidal anti-Semitism in the Republican Party, including the embrace of Nazis and white nationalists and many anti-Jewish tropes. Second, it riles up and grows Trump's base by turning red against blue, by blaming educational elites for all that ails America. Third, it further weakens the credibility of and support for educational institutions among the American public. And because educational institutions, both public and private, are important pillars of democracy, this weakens and undermines democracy itself. And fourth, it attempts to split Jews away from educational institutions and liberal coalitions and away from the Democratic Party. This fourth goal is where we come in, because it's up to us as Jews to decide whether we will play along, whether we will help Donald Trump achieve this goal, or whether we will speak out against attempts to use us to undermine democracy. It makes sense that many of us have been vulnerable to being used in this way so far. We are traumatized. October 7th threw gas on the flames of our always simmering fear that someone out there, is coming to kill us. The extent of the atrocities on October 7th, including the extreme sexual violence, has largely not been reported in most places. I have not given details here in any of my many sermons because the details are so brutal. They are difficult to say out loud, and they are scarring to hear. News came out this week that Hamas operatives were stockpiling weapons for terrorist attacks on Jews in multiple European cities. Yes, we are terribly afraid, and rightly so. October 7th also threw gas on the flames of our fear that a lot of people, even sometimes neighbors and coworkers and friends, are indifferent to whether we live or die, and are quick to turn on us, and are ready to believe that we're wrong, bad, even evil. Many of us are liberals and believe in liberal institutions and are connected to universities and colleges and have children there, and are shocked by the virulence of the anti-Semitism on display in those environments, as well as in many of our liberal workplaces and our progressive coalitions. It has been deeply painful for us. We feel isolated and abandoned by people we thought shared our values and had our backs. Meanwhile, many of us do not agree with the Israeli government, are horrified by the mass deaths of Gazans and the desperate humanitarian crisis there, have been calling for an end to all indiscriminate killing and for immediate humanitarian relief, and still find ourselves targeted by anti-Semitic attacks. No wonder we are hurt and angry and defensive. But as Jay Michelson wrote in the foreword this week, when we react emotionally instead of intelligently, we make mistakes. As a vulnerable minority, Jews are safer in a country that values reflection, tolerance, education, and reason, none of which our self-appointed guardians are displaying right now. Anti-Semitism is real, he said, but these academic scapegoats are not the cause of it. We are being exploited by people who do not have our best interests at heart. We need to pause for a moment before we hurt somebody, starting with ourselves. Okay, so then what? So what do we do? First, we need everyone to recognize that anti-Semitism on college campuses is real and dangerous, and we need everyone to take it seriously. The dynamic we see today has been building for decades, but many of us progressives have been slow to acknowledge it, focusing instead on the anti-Semitic threat on the right. Anti-Semitism on both the left and the right is real and dangerous, on college campuses and beyond. DEI programs at universities and throughout our society often fail to understand anti-Semitism or recognize its danger, often seeing Israel as uniquely evil, which, by the way, is anti-Semitic, and seeing white Jews only as white people with privilege. Because racism is rightly the core concern of DEI work in the United States, given its foundational role in American history, and because anti-Semitism is not understood by most people, DEI officers often fail to see it or apprehend its gravity. This needs to change. Diagnosing anti-Semitism has to become a core competency of DEI. I'm going to say that again. Diagnosing anti-Semitism has to become a core competency of DEI. Second, let's not demonize young people for their passion. College students are differentiating from their parents, forming their identities in a world that is profoundly disappointing. Think about the state of the world that they're inheriting. They're in the midst of discerning who they are and what their place should be in a very broken world. And the fact that many of them are angry and devastated by oppression and injustice is a good thing. Once upon a time, many of us were also on the barricades, and it's possible we too oversimplified complexity. Many of us still do. But what universities should be are places that grow students' capacity to reflect deeply and to hold nuance and to hold complexity. Third, while anti-Semitism education must become widespread everywhere in our society, from K through 12 schools to colleges and universities to every workplace, codifying a definition of anti-Semitism is a mistake. There are three prevailing definitions of anti-Semitism: the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IRA definition, the Nexus definition, and the Jerusalem definition. Jews do not agree on these definitions, primarily as they address anti-Zionism. This is complex. Some say all anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Some say none of it is. My position is that not all anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, but a lot of it is. Remember that the Satmar Hasidim are anti-Zionist, and that anti-Zionism was preached from this bima and many other Reform congregations in the 20s and 30s. But it's one thing for Jewish people to think that we shouldn't establish ourselves in the land of Israel until the Messiah comes, or to argue before there was a modern state of Israel that we should invest in American Jewish life instead of Zionism. And it's a very different thing to say that the 7 million Jews who currently live in Israel have no right to be there and no right to govern themselves. Especially if you believe that Palestinians do have a right to live there and govern themselves, which I do, then believing that Jews are less worthy or deserving of self-determination, that Jewish history is less real or authentic in that land, or that Jewish lives are less valuable, that's anti-Semitism. However, and let me say this very clearly, being pro-Palestinian or being extremely critical of Israel is not anti-Semitic. Most of our congregation is pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli and extremely critical of the Israeli government. Given this complexity, defining anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism in the law is a mistake. And using the law to sanction anti-Zionist speech is also a mistake. There have been and will be many attempts to codify IRA as law, which does that. We don't try to define racism in the law. And given that Jewish leaders are currently debating the very different definitions of anti-Semitism, it's not the role of Congress or any other legislative body to decide that for us. This is especially true as so many of the people chanting slogans don't even know what they mean. As our member and the former president of Brandeis University, Fred Lawrence, said recently on CNN, a lot of what's happening on college campuses is naivete at best and ignorance at worst. You will never punish your way into solving ignorance. The way you solve ignorance is education, and that's what higher education is meant to do. Fourth, university presidents and all leaders need to speak out loudly and clearly against anti-Semitism. As Fred Lawrence said, there are three kinds of speech: threatening behavior, which should be prohibited; tough discussions of tough issues, which should be allowed to play out; and words that are offensive or hateful, which require a forceful response by leadership. University leadership, and the leadership of all institutions, must be ready to say, our institution has a view. We denounce hate. We care deeply. We have a position. And rather than repressing non-threatening hateful speech, leaders must allow it to happen, speak out against it, articulate clearly the values of the institution, and maximize opportunities for the community to learn, to make nuanced distinctions, and to increase awareness of complexity. Fifth, we all must do our best to refrain from contributing to cancel culture. Everyone has a role in this. Cancel culture will hurt Jews as much as or more than anyone else. In fact, Jews are being canceled now from public appearances, organizations, coalitions, and friendships. Given how much of this moment is rife with superficial truth, given that deep truth is about putting disparate pieces together, this is a time to offer the benefit of the doubt wherever possible and to keep the lines of communication open wherever possible. We cannot expect to understand each other or to learn if we shut down dialogue. Now, of course, there are limits. If someone is celebrating my death or indifferent to my death, I don't have to invite them to my party. But short of reasonable limits, we must make as much room as possible to stay in the conversation with each other and try to grow in understanding. And to that end, I want to make clear that you do not have to agree with me or any of the clergy at CBE to fully belong and be welcome here. Whatever your views on Israel-Palestine or this war, you belong here. We have room in this community for a wide spectrum of belief, and though it is my job to speak loudly and clearly for our institution and our values, and I will continue to do so, it is also deeply important to CBE that we have that broad diversity of views, that we continually grow our capacity to hold complexity, to stay in the discomfort of not always agreeing with each other, and that we keep that conversation open across our differences. Every week during our announcements, you heard it today, we describe how diverse our congregation is. That diversity includes ideology and perspective. The only thing that you can assume, the only thing you should assume, is that every person you meet at CBE belongs here exactly as much as you do. Our goal now, as American Jews, must be to protect both our Jewish community and our democracy. We have to keep our eye on both equally because our well-being depends on both equally. Let us take as our example Joseph Hatzadik, who was so gifted at seeing truth in the deepest, darkest places. This week, when it comes to confronting his own great pain of abandonment and betrayal by his brothers, at first he's unable to see the deep truth beneath all the falsehoods. We see him weep. We see that he cannot at first give his brothers the benefit of the doubt. We see him use his power to threaten them. But as painful as it is, he stays in conversation with his brothers until he sees that they have changed. And then in next week's Parsha, he will finally see how all the disparate pieces fit together, how his brothers, who seemed like his enemies, were actually part of a greater wholeness that enabled him to avert disaster and save many lives. May we too remain steady and reflective through this extremely painful time, keeping the conversation open, looking for deep truth underneath all the superficial, partial truths and falsehoods, determined to find the place where truth and compassion meet, bringing us toward wholeness and toward new life. Shabbat shalom.